At 69, I stood in a luxury hotel, wearing a server's uniform holding a tray of champagne, while my son married into one of the richest families in the city. I wasn't invited. I didn't even know it was his wedding until I saw his face on the giant portrait by the ballroom. When I whispered, "I'm the groom's father," the bride smiled coldly. "You're working tonight?" Then my son turned to security and said, "Remove this server." That was when I knew he had gone too far. Welcome to Dad's Sweet Revenge. Before we begin, drop a comment for me. Have you ever had to make yourself invisible for someone you love? Your perspective matters here. Quick note, some details are fictionalized to strengthen the message, but the heart of this story, the lesson, is what I hope stays with you. I'm Harold Bennett, 69 years old, and I've been standing in school kitchens since before most of these kids were born. The pre-dawn darkness wraps around Jefferson High, like it always does at 5:30 in the morning, and my hands already know what to do before my mind fully wakes. Flip the industrial burners, check the ovens, pull the flour bins from storage. 31 years I've done this. 31 years of measuring pancake batter by feel and knowing exactly how many trays of scrambled eggs it takes to feed 400 teenagers who won't remember my name by lunchtime. The kitchen smells like old grease and industrial soap, the kind that never quite leaves your skin no matter how hard you scrub. I like it. It's honest. There's a rhythm to this work that settles something in me, the hiss of the griddle, when the first ladle of batter hits the metallic clang of serving trays stacking in the cart, the low hum of the walk-in freezer that's been threatening to die for 3 years, but somehow keeps going. I pull on the hairnet and the plastic gloves, same motions every morning, and catch my reflection in the stainless steel hood above the stove. Gray hairlines around my eyes, deep enough to plant seeds in shoulders that used to be broader before age and gravity had their say. But my hands are still steady. That's what matters in a kitchen. My son has a life I never dared to dream of. That's what I tell people when they ask, which isn't often. Evan built something from nothing, they say. Started his own company, made his own fortune, the kind of success story you read about in business magazines at the dentist's office. I haven't seen him in 8 months, maybe 9. He's busy, I understand. I reach for my wallet during the lull, before the first bell rings, pulling out the photo I keep tucked behind my driver's license. The edges are soft from years of handling the colors, faded to that vintage warmth old photographs get. Evan at 7 years old, sleeping on my shoulder in the emergency room. You can see the white bandages wrapped around my left forearm in the frame. Smell the antiseptic and smoke, even though it's just paper and memory. That photo is from the night I carried him out of the fire. I say to no one because the kitchen is empty and some truths need to be spoken, even if nobody's listening. He was 7. He said, "Daddy, you smell like smoke." No. The burn scar still runs from my wrist to my elbow, pale and shiny like melted wax. I don't hide it. It's part of the job description of being a father. You run into burning buildings because your child is inside, and you don't think about it until later when the nurse is wrapping gauze and your son is safe and crying into your shirt. I look down at my hand holding the spatula. 69 years old. Still here. Still cooking. Still waiting for my son to call. The pancakes don't care about any of that. They just need to be flipped before they burn. By the time I get home that evening, my feet ache in the specific way that only 10 hours on industrial tile can produce. My apartment is small. Kitchen, bedroom, bathroom, living room that doubles as everything else. I bought it with Nora 42 years ago, back when the neighborhood was rougher and the rent was something a cafeteria worker could afford. Now it's gentrifying around me like a tide I don't have the energy to swim against. The glass cabinet sits on the kitchen counter, where it always does, catching the last of the evening light through the window. Inside are 2 things: Nora's wedding ring, the small gold band I slipped on her finger in 1976, and the letter she wrote me 3 weeks before she died. Nora Bennett had been gone 15 years, but her wedding ring sat in that glass cabinet like a promise I was still keeping. The letter was folded in precise thirds, her handwriting visible through the thin paper blue ink careful loops. The penmanship of a woman who believed words mattered. I've never had the courage to read it again. Once was enough. Once was too much. She'd written it in the hospice room while I was out getting her favorite soup from the diner, 2 blocks away, the one that made chicken noodle the way her mother used to. When I came back, she handed it to me and said, "Don't read this until after. Promise me, Harold." I promised. The letter said a lot of things, most of them true, some of them harder to hear than the cancer diagnosis. But the line I remember, the one that's burned into my memory, deeper than any fire scar, was this: "Harold, you love Evan in such a way that you forget you need to be loved too." How long had it been since I'd opened that letter? 15 years? Or had I simply been too afraid to read it twice? I make myself a sandwich, turkey, mustard, lettuce. That's a day past crisp, and sit at the small kitchen table that wobbles, unless you fold a napkin, under the short leg. The evening news plays on the television. In the living room, something about interest rates and a Senate hearing, the kind of background noise that keeps you from feeling like you're completely alone. I think about calling Evan. I think about it the same way I think about it every Friday evening, with my phone 6 inches from my hand and a dozen excuses why I shouldn't. He's busy. He's building something. He doesn't need his father asking about his day like he's still a child. I don't call. Instead, I wash my plate dry. It put it back in the cabinet where it lives between the other 3 plates that make up my full collection. I pull out the catering company's schedule from my bag, weekend shifts. Pay time and a half, and my retirement account could use the help. I flip the calendar page to Saturday and see the printed note in Martin's handwriting. SAT Private Wedding Event, Lakeside Grand Hotel. Client name Bennett Capital Events, LLC. Bennett's a common name. I know 4 Bennetts in Nashville, maybe 5, if you count the dentist whose sign I pass on the way to work. I stare at the note for a moment, feeling something I can't quite name. Not recognition, not yet just the strange weight of a familiar word in an unfamiliar context. I fold the paper and slip it back into my bag. Tomorrow I'll cater a wedding for someone who shares my last name and doesn't know I exist. Saturday morning I drove to the catering office expecting nothing more complicated than serving appetizers to strangers. The building sat in an industrial park off Murfreesboro Pike, the kind of low-rent space where small businesses go to survive on thin margins. I'd been picking up weekend shifts here for 3 years. Weddings, corporate events, the occasional funeral reception where nobody eats and everyone drinks too much. Martin Cole stood at the front of the break room with a stack of folders. 47 years old and 20 years deep in the catering business. He had the efficient manner of a man who'd seen every kind of event and stopped being surprised by human behavior around year 5. Bennett Capital Private Celebration. Martin said, sliding folders across the table to the weekend crew. Lakeside Grand Hotel, high-dollar client. Dress code is white shirt, black vest, standard service protocol. Cocktail hour starts at 4, dinner at 6, open bar until 11. I took the folder and flipped it open. Event timeline, floor plan, menu notes. Past hors d'oeuvres during cocktail hour plated. Dinner service, champagne toast at 7:30. What company is Bennett Capital? I asked more out of habit than curiosity. Martin shrugged. Some kind of financial startup. The groom's name is E. Bennett. Paid in full 2 months ago, which is all I care about. E. Bennett. I stared at the name for a moment. Bennett was a common surname. Half the phone book in Nashville had a Bennett somewhere in it. But I stood there 5 seconds too long, folder in my hand, trying to remember the last time Evan had called. 3 months. 4. He was busy. He had a company to run. I didn't even know what his company was called. I turned the page and scanned the VIP guest list names. I didn't recognize titles, like Chief Investment Officer and Senior Partner. Then halfway down the second column, I saw it. Samuel Price. The name was familiar in the way old songs are familiar. You know, you've heard it before, but you can't remember where or when. Someone from Jefferson High, probably. A teacher, maybe, or a parent. I'd served lunch to 1,000 times over 3 decades. The kind of face that blurs into the background of your memory until something pulls it back into focus. You good with appetizer trays? Martin asked. I folded the briefing and slipped it into my jacket pocket. Yeah, I'm good. I didn't know that the name E. Bennett was the baby I'd carried out of the fire 27 years ago. I didn't know that Samuel Price would recognize me before I recognized him. I didn't know that in 36 hours I'd be standing in a hotel service hallway wishing I'd never opened that folder. But Saturday afternoon I just drove home and made myself dinner and watched a documentary about the national parks that I forgot as soon as it ended. Sunday morning came the way Sunday mornings always do. too early and too bright. I showered and dressed in the bathroom that still had Nora's towel hook on the back of the door, the one I'd never taken down because taking it down felt like erasing her twice. White shirt, black vest, black pants. The uniform of invisible people. I stood in front of the mirror and pulled my collar up. The burn scar on my neck was 4 inches long and narrow the shape of the beam that had fallen across my shoulder when I went back into the house for Evan. The skin was pale and smooth, shinier than the rest of me, the kind of scar that makes people ask questions you don't want to answer. I'd worn high collars for 27 years, not because I was ashamed, because scars are supposed to remind you of what you survived, and this one just reminded me that the person I'd saved didn't call anymore. I buttoned the collar and adjusted the vest. In the kitchen, I stood at the counter and looked at the clock. 6:45 in the morning. The wedding didn't start until 4 in the afternoon, but I've never been good at sitting still when I know there's work ahead. So I did what I always do when my hands need something to occupy them. I baked cornbread, the kind Evan used to love when he was small, before he developed tastes for things I couldn't pronounce on restaurant menus. I mixed the batter by feel cornmeal flour, buttermilk, a little sugar, not too much. The oven preheated with that ticking sound old appliances make, and I poured the batter into a small tin and slid it onto the center rack. 20 minutes later, the kitchen smelled like childhood. Like Saturday mornings when Evan would sit at this same table doing homework and I'd cut him a square of cornbread, with butter melting into the center. Like the year after Nora died, when cooking was the only language I had left to say I love you. I cut a small piece, wrapped it in wax paper, and put it in a tin box. Then I slipped the box into my apron pocket. No particular reason, just that sometimes when I baked cornbread, I thought of Evan. And maybe, if I ran into him someday, if he ever came back to Nashville and stopped by, unannounced, the way I used to daydream, I could give him a piece. Remind him of something good. I locked the apartment door behind me and walked to my car. The Nashville sky was still purple at the edges, the sun not quite committed to the day yet. The air smelled like rain that hadn't fallen and gasoline from the gas station 2 blocks over. I didn't know this was the last morning I would leave my apartment as a father. I didn't know that in 10 hours I'd be standing next to a dumpster with that tin box of cornbread crushed on the concrete behind me. I didn't know that the name E. Bennett on the folder in my jacket pocket was the same person who used to fall asleep on my shoulder, smelling like smoke and fear, and the particular innocence of 7-year-olds who still believe their fathers can save them from anything. I just got in my car and drove to the Lakeside Grand Hotel, because that's what you do when you're 69, and you've spent your whole life showing up on time to feed people who will never know your name. The bus to the hotel was half empty. Sunday morning, quiet. I took a window seat and adjusted my collar, feeling the fabric pull against the scar tissue on my neck. And just like that, I wasn't 69 anymore. I was 42, standing in a burning hallway, hearing my son scream. The apartment we rented back then was old wood frame, drafty windows, the kind landlords forgot about until something broke. Winter night, 1996. The kind of cold that makes you pile extra blankets on a 7-year-old's bed. I woke up to smoke, gray-black clouds rolling across the ceiling. Nora was already awake, grabbing my arm, shouting something I couldn't hear over my heart hammering. Then I heard Evan crying. His bedroom was at the end of the hall. The smoke was thick, low enough I had to crouch, but I could hear him, that particular pitch of a child's fear that bypasses your brain and goes straight to your legs. Daddy. I didn't think. Thinking is what stops you. I just moved forward, hands out, feeling along the wall until I found his doorframe. He was in the corner by his bed, curled up small, coughing. I grabbed him and turned back. That's when something fell, a ceiling beam part of the doorframe. It hit my shoulder and neck, and the pain was bright and immediate, and somehow distant, like it was happening to someone else's body. I kept moving. Nora was in the hallway screaming my name, and then we were outside in the cold air. Evan had his arms locked around my neck, crying but breathing. That's all that mattered. Daddy, he said, his voice small and scared and 7 years old. You smell like smoke. That was the last thing Evan said to me in a voice without distance. I looked down at my hand on the bus railing. 40 years old that year. Now 69. And I still covered that scar every day, not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't want it to remind me that the person I'd saved no longer needed saving. The bus turned onto West End Avenue, and another memory surfaced. The hospital, 19 years ago. Nora was dying. Not the kind where you hold out hope for a miracle. The kind where the doctor uses words like palliative and comfortable and makes meaningful eye contact that means prepare yourself. She was in a hospital bed with rails and an IV, and she told me she wanted to write me a letter. Nora, you don't need to. Yes, I do, she said, cutting me off with a firmness that meant she'd already decided. Not a will, just things I need you to remember. She made me hand her pen and paper. Her handwriting was shaky, but still hers. Careful loops the way she crossed her T's with a flourish. It took her 20 minutes to write what would have taken 5 when she was healthy. I sat by the window and watched her memorizing the concentration on her face. When she finished, she folded the paper in precise thirds and handed it to me. Don't read this now, she said. Wait until after. After what? Her eyes held mine, and I saw everything love and sorrow, and a knowing that made my chest tight. After I'm gone, you'll know when, I promised. But before I could put the letter away, she reached out and took my hand. Her fingers were thin, the skin papery and cool. Harold, she said, her voice quiet but steady, you love Evan in such a way that you forget you need to be loved too. When I'm gone, you'll pour all that love into him, and he won't understand it, not because he's bad, but because you never taught him that love costs something. I didn't know what to say, so I just held her hand and nodded. How does a mother know what her son will become before the boy himself knows? How does a woman dying in a hospital bed see 20 years into the future and write it down in careful handwriting? Nora died 6 months later. The letter she wrote I kept in a glass cabinet next to her wedding ring. I read it once the day after the funeral, standing in our kitchen at 3 in the morning because I couldn't sleep. Then I folded it back up and put it away. I never opened it again, not because I forgot what it said, because I remembered exactly what it said, and I was afraid that if I read it twice, I'd have to admit she was right. That the way I loved Evan, the way I sacrificed and provided, and never asked for anything back, wasn't teaching him how to love. It was teaching him that love was something he deserved, without having to earn it, or return it, or even acknowledge it. The letter I kept unopened, afraid she wrote exactly what is happening now. The bus pulled up to the Lakeside Grand Hotel brakes, hissing, and I stood. The tin box of cornbread shifted in my apron pocket, and I thought about Evan at 7, smelling like smoke and fear and trust. I stepped off the bus into the Sunday morning sunlight, Nora's warning still echoing in my head, and walked toward the service entrance. Something I couldn't name had been sitting in my chest since that morning, a weight I didn't have a word for yet. When did my son stop being willing to say the word father in front of his friends? I stepped off the bus at the Lakeside Grand Hotel, with Nora's warning still echoing in my head, and another memory surfaced. This one from 18 years ago when Evan was 16, and I was still convincing myself that everything would be fine, as long as he succeeded. It was a Thursday afternoon in 2005. I'd picked up a catering shift that ended at 3, which meant I could swing by Evan's private school for pickup. The scholarship covered tuition, but it didn't cover the fact that every other kid in that parking lot had parents who drove cars less than 10 years old and wore clothes that didn't smell like industrial kitchens. I pulled up in my '92 Honda Civic, the one with the passenger door that stuck and the muffler that announced my arrival 3 blocks before I got there. I was still in my work uniform, black pants, white shirt, the vest with the catering company logo on the breast pocket. I'd meant to change, but the shift ran long, and I didn't want Evan waiting. He was standing with 3 classmates near the front steps, all of them in the kind of casual clothes that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. I saw him see me, saw the half-second pause, the calculation in his face. I got out of the car and waved. Evan said something to his friends and walked toward me, not quickly, not slowly, just carefully like he was measuring each step. One of the boys called out loud enough for me to hear, "Is that your dad?" Evan didn't turn around. He kept walking, and when he was close enough that only I could hear, he said over his shoulder, "He works in food service." Not my father, not Harold, not even my dad. Just food service. I stood there by the car door, my hand on the handle, and heard every word clearly. The late afternoon sun was warm on my shoulders. A group of mothers stood by the curb chatting. Someone's car alarm chirped twice. Everything was completely normal except for the fact that my son had just reduced me to a job category. I opened the passenger door, the one that stuck, and smiled when Evan got in. "How was school, son?" "Fine." We drove home, and Evan sat next to me looking at his phone. I didn't ask any more questions. I told myself the same thing I'd been telling myself since he started at that school. As long as he gets into a good university, that's enough. As long as he has opportunities I never had, that's enough. I've told myself that phrase so many times over so many years. As long as he succeeds, that's enough. As long as he's happy. As long as he gets what he wants. I spent 30 years making myself smaller, so Evan could be bigger. And at what point did smaller become invisible? The memory shifted forward to 8 months ago, early 2023. Evan had called to say he wanted me to meet someone. "Her name's Claire," he'd said on the phone, his voice carrying that careful tone he used when he was managing me. "We'll do dinner, somewhere nice." Claire Whitmore, 31, and every bit her family's heiress, was impeccably polite across the restaurant table. The kind of place where the menu doesn't have prices, and the waiter refills your water glass before you realize it's empty. I'd worn my only suit, the one I bought for Nora's funeral 15 years ago. The elbows were worn thin, and the shoulders didn't quite fit anymore, but it was clean and pressed. Claire asked me about my work with the warmth of someone conducting an interview. How long had I been in food service? Did I enjoy it? Had I always worked in Nashville? I answered honestly because I've never learned how to do otherwise. 31 years at Jefferson High. Yes, I enjoyed feeding kids. Born and raised in Nashville, never lived anywhere else. And while I talked, I watched her eyes move. From my face to my hands, on the table, calloused, thick-knuckled, the hands of someone who'd spent decades lifting heavy pots and scrubbing industrial equipment. Her gaze lingered on the burn scar visible at my wrist, the one that wrapped around to my palm. Not a look of curiosity or sympathy. That look. I saw it for half a second, the way her eyes moved from my face to my hands, to the scar, and back to my face. Like she was taking inventory. Like she was already deciding what to do with the information. After dinner, Evan walked me to my car while Claire waited by the restaurant entrance. "So what do you think?" he asked. "She seems very accomplished," I said, which was true and safe. Evan looked back toward the restaurant where Claire stood checking her phone. "Dad, Claire's family is very particular about image. You understand, right?" I understood. I always understood. That's what I did, understood and accepted and smiled and said it was fine. "Of course," I told him. He hugged me quickly, the kind of hug you give someone when other people are watching, and I drove home thinking that at least he'd wanted me to meet her. At least that meant something. I didn't know that night, after I drove home in my '92 Honda. With the sticky passenger door, Claire had gone back to their apartment and searched online for the catering company I worked for. Looked up the client list, the event calendar, the contact information. She'd started planning from the moment she saw that scar on my hand, the scar I got pulling her future husband out of a fire when he was 7 years old, and still called me Daddy. I walked toward the service entrance of the Lakeside Grand Hotel, carrying that realization in my chest like something sharp and heavy. The cornbread box in my apron pocket felt suddenly foolish, a tin of baked nostalgia for a son who'd spent 8 months ensuring I would never be more than food service. I wasn't in the room when my son decided I didn't belong at his wedding. I pieced this together later from what Martin told me from the timeline of the emails from the particular silences when Evan finally came to my door. But I know how that conversation must have gone the way you know the shape of a wound from the scar it leaves. 6 months ago, March 2023, Evan and Claire's apartment, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Nashville and furniture that looked like it came from magazines I'd never read. Claire would have chosen the moment carefully, not during a fight, not when emotions were high. She was too smart for that. Probably a Sunday evening after dinner when Evan was relaxed and full and not expecting to have to defend anything. "We need to talk about the wedding," she would have said. And Evan, my son, who'd learned to be wary of conversations that started with, "We need to talk," would have tensed. "What about it?" "Your father." A pause. Maybe Evan looked out those floor-to-ceiling windows watching the city lights flicker on as the sun set. Maybe he already knew what was coming. "What about him? He cannot attend the wedding." Claire's voice would have been calm, matter-of-fact, the tone of someone stating an obvious conclusion. "He doesn't fit the Whitmore family image." I imagine Evan tried to object. I have to imagine it because the alternative that he didn't even try is something I can't hold in my mind for long without feeling like I'm suffocating. Claire, he's my father. He's your past, she would have said, and this is the part I know is accurate because these were nearly the exact words Evan used later when he was trying to explain without really explaining. You get to choose your future. You don't have to carry your past into it. That's not Evan. She would have moved closer, maybe taken his hand, used the voice she probably used in boardrooms, when she needed someone to see things her way. You've built an entire narrative about being self-made, about starting from nothing and building Bennett Capital through pure determination and vision. A cafeteria chef as your father will destroy that narrative in 5 seconds. And there it was, the weaponization of everything I'd given him. The education I'd worked 3 jobs to afford, the opportunities I'd sacrificed my own comfort to provide the foundation I'd built so he could reach higher than I ever could. All of it turned into ammunition against me. My investors know my story, Evan would have said, but his voice would have been weaker now. My team knows. They know what you've told them. They know the version where you pulled yourself up by your bootstraps. They don't know about the man who made those bootstraps possible. A pause, letting it sink in, and they don't need to. Your origin story works because it's clean, simple, compelling. Adding complications ruins it. Complications, that's what I was, a complication. How does a son become a stranger? Not all at once, not in a single conversation. It happens in degrees, a word here, a silence there, until one day you realize the person you raised has learned to live as though you never existed. What are you suggesting? Evan would have asked, and the fact that he asked, instead of objecting, tells you everything you need to know. We simply don't send him an invitation. The wedding is for Whitmore family and business associates. He wouldn't know anyone. He wouldn't be comfortable. We'd actually be doing him a favor. A favor. Erasing me from the most important day of my son's life was a favor. I imagine Evan sat there for a long time, maybe staring at his hands, maybe running through calculations in his head. What he owed me versus what it would cost him, love versus advancement, father versus future. Okay, he would have finally said, just that, okay. And in my small apartment across town, I didn't know that my fate had just been decided. In a living room I'd never seen by a woman I'd met once, over an expensive dinner where I'd worn my funeral suit and tried to make a good impression. No invitation arrived at my address. Not that week, not that month. I waited 6 months. Every time I heard footsteps on the porch, I thought today. Every time the phone rang, I thought, maybe. I bought a new shirt, light blue, on sale at the outlet mall, but new and crisp and appropriate for a wedding. I got my hair cut. I practiced what I'd say when I saw him at the ceremony, how I'd hug him without crying, how I'd tell him I was proud without making it about me. I was ready. I had always been ready. I just didn't know there was nothing to be ready for. Because while I was waiting for an invitation, Claire had been making different arrangements. She'd taken the information she'd gathered during our single dinner, the catering company name, my work schedule, my obvious need for extra income, and she'd designed something more elegant than simple exclusion. She'd hired me, not as a guest, not as family, as staff, as food service. The catering company got a contract for Bennett Capital Private Celebration. Martin Cole called it a high-dollar client and asked if I wanted weekend overtime. I said yes, because I always said yes to weekend shifts, because retirement accounts don't fund themselves, and old men who work in cafeterias don't get to turn down time and a half. I didn't know I was saying yes to serving hors d'oeuvres at my own son's wedding. I didn't know that the invitation I'd been waiting for would arrive in the form of a work assignment. I didn't know that Claire had spent 6 months turning exclusion into employment, absence into presence, but wrong all wrong. The service entrance hallway smelled like bleach and kitchen grease. Voices echoed from somewhere deeper in the hotel. I stood there with the cornbread box in my apron pocket and 27 years of sacrifice on my shoulders, and I finally understood. The ultimate humiliation wasn't being excluded. It was being recategorized. I wasn't missing from my son's wedding. I was there. I just wasn't there as his father. The service entrance smells like industrial cleaner and old carpet, and I'm carrying a clipboard with my name checked off, like inventory. But that understanding, the recategorization, the deliberate humiliation, stays theoretical until you're actually standing in the place where it's happening. until you're walking through the back door of a hotel with 6 other servers in matching vests, listening to Martin Cole distribute assignments, like you're all interchangeable parts in a machine designed to make rich people comfortable. Sunday, 3 p.m. The Lakeside Grand Hotel service corridor is narrow and fluorescent lit, the kind of space guests never see. Martin stands near the staff room door with his clipboard checking names, assigning positions. Denise, you're on champagne service during the ceremony. Tony, you've got cocktail tables. Harold, you're on appetizer trays in the main hall starting at 4:30. I nod. My hands are steady. I've done this work for 3 decades. You learn how to be steady even when you're not. A young woman adjusts her vest near the doorway, her dark hair pulled back in the regulation style, and she keeps looking at me with the expression of someone trying to place a face. Finally, she approaches. Mr. Harold. I look up. She's 23, maybe 24, with the kind of face that's familiar, in the way all young faces are familiar when you've worked in schools. They blur together into a collective memory of childhood. You used to work at Jefferson High cafeteria, right? Her voice is quiet, tentative, like she's afraid she might be wrong. You always saved me the last tray every Friday. And then I see her. Not the server in the vest, but the girl underneath, 12 years old, always arriving late to lunch because she had to finish a makeup test, or stayed behind to help a teacher walking into an empty cafeteria, where the trays were already cleared. Denise Walker, I say, and something warm breaks through the numbness. You grew up. She smiles, and it's genuine, the kind of smile that reminds you why you did the work in the first place. I did. I'm at Vanderbilt now, just doing this on weekends for tuition money. That's good. That's real good. I never thanked you, she says, for the trays, for making sure there was always something left. She hesitates. Things were hard at home back then. Some days that lunch was the only meal I got. I adjust the collar of my vest, feeling the familiar pull of the scar beneath the fabric. You don't need to thank me. That was the job. It was more than the job, she says quietly. Then Martin calls her name, and she gives me one more quick smile before heading toward her station. For a moment, standing in that fluorescent corridor, with servers bustling around me, I feel something close to pride. I had fed her. I had fed so many of them. And some of them remembered. That had to count for something. Martin hands me an empty tray. Main hall is through that corridor left at the lobby. You know the drill. I take the tray and walk. The corridor from the service area to the main hall runs parallel to the hotel lobby. You can hear the guests arriving, the murmur of expensive voices, the click of heels on marble, the kind of ambient wealth that has a sound all its own. I'm focused on walking on, holding the tray steady, on being invisible, the way good servers are invisible. That's when I see it. The photograph. It's mounted on the lobby wall where the corridor opens up, massive, maybe 4 feet wide, professionally, lit with soft focus around the edges. Fresh flower arrangements sit on pedestals on either side. The kind of display you can't miss, designed specifically to announce something important. I look because you can't not look at something that big and prominent. Just a glance as I'm walking past. The couple in the photograph are perfect. Magazine perfect. The bride wears white blonde hair swept up, holding a bouquet of white roses. The groom stands beside her in a black tuxedo, his hair neatly styled, his posture confident, his smile. His smile. I stop walking. That smile. The tilt of the head, the set of the shoulders, the way his eyes crinkle slightly at the corners when he's genuinely happy. I know that smile. I watched it develop from toothless baby grin to gap-toothed childhood, to self-conscious adolescence, to this polished professional perfect. The tray in my hands is empty, but suddenly feels like it weighs 100 pounds. It's Evan. My son is the groom in this photograph. My son is getting married here today in this hotel. The wedding I've been hired to serve is his wedding. Somewhere behind me, someone asks if I need help finding something. I don't answer. I can't answer. My entire field of vision has narrowed to that photograph to Evan's face, older than the last time I saw him, but unmistakably his standing beside a woman I recognized from one dinner 8 months ago when I wore my funeral suit and tried to make conversation about work I didn't understand. Claire. The bride is Claire. And suddenly every piece clicks into place with sickening clarity. E. Bennett on the briefing. Bennett Capital Events, LLC. The VIP guest list I'd glanced at and dismissed. The 6 months of waiting for an invitation that never came. Claire searching for my catering company the night we met. All of it was leading to this moment, me standing in a corridor, wearing a server's vest, holding an empty tray, staring at my son's wedding portrait. A hotel staff member brushes past me, muttering something about blocking the walkway. The world keeps moving. Music plays somewhere distant. Guests laugh in the lobby. Everything continues exactly as it's supposed to, except I'm completely still. I stood there with the tray in my hand and wondered, am I mistaken? Did I get it wrong? But no. That smile, I know it. I watched it grow up. I watched it learn to talk, to read, to charm teachers and win scholarships and build companies. I watched it turn away from me in a private school parking lot while saying the words food service, like they were a category instead of a person. That's my son in the photograph. And I'm here to serve him appetizers. I picked up the tray and walked back toward the service station because that's what you do when you've spent 69 years being the person who doesn't make a scene. The choice wasn't conscious, not really. It was muscle memory. It was the same instinct that made me smile at teenagers who didn't say thank you and nod at administrators who forgot my name and accept every excuse Evan gave for why he couldn't visit. You learn to swallow things. You learn to keep moving. The cocktail lounge was filling up guests in expensive suits and dresses, the kind of people who looked like they belonged in hotels with marble floors and crystal chandeliers. I loaded my tray with appetizers in the service station and carried it through the crowd, offering crab cakes and stuffed mushrooms to strangers, who took them without looking at my face. Denise Walker appeared beside me during a lull, refilling her champagne flutes from a bottle. "Mr. Harold," she said quietly, "are you okay? You look... Is something wrong?" I forced a smile, the same smile I'd been using for decades. "I'm fine." "You don't look fine." "Just a long day. I'm good." She didn't push, but I could feel her watching me for the rest of the cocktail hour, the way you watch someone standing too close to the edge of something. I told myself stories while I worked. Maybe Evan didn't know I'd be assigned to this event. Maybe the catering company didn't tell him which servers would be working. Maybe when he saw me, if he saw me, he'd be surprised, embarrassed, apologetic. Maybe this was all a terrible coincidence that we'd laugh about later years from now, when enough time had passed to make it funny instead of devastating. But I watched him across the room, standing in the center of his wedding party, shaking hands and accepting congratulations, and he never once looked toward the serving staff, never once glanced in my direction, and I realized he knew. Of course he knew. Claire had planned this too carefully for him not to know. How long can you stand in a room pretending you don't exist, while watching the person you raise pretend he built himself? How long can you smile at strangers offering them champagne, while the person you carried out of a fire talks to his new wife as though you were never born? I lasted through cocktail hour, through the announcement to move to the main ballroom, through the first course of dinner when I carried plates from the kitchen to the serving station and watched other servers deliver them to tables, where 200 guests celebrated my son's wedding. Then came the speeches. The ballroom was elegant round tables, with white linens, centerpieces of roses and hydrangeas, soft lighting, that made everything look like a photograph. Evan stood at the head table with Claire beside him, both of them glowing in that particular way people glow when they're the center of attention and enjoying it. The best man spoke first, telling stories about Evan's college years that I'd never heard. Claire's father spoke next, welcoming Evan into the Whitmore family with the kind of formal warmth that comes with old money and practiced speeches. Then Evan took the microphone. I was standing near the back of the room with my tray of champagne glasses, refilling as needed, invisible in the way servers are supposed to be invisible. "I want to thank everyone who helped shape the man I am today," Evan said, his voice carrying across the ballroom with the confidence of someone who'd given presentations to investors and board members. "My beautiful wife, Claire, whose family has welcomed me with such generosity. My mentors who saw potential in me when I was just starting out. My team at Bennett Capital, who believed in the vision." He paused and the room was quiet, attentive waiting. "I built this life from nothing," he continued, "from absolute zero. Everything I have, this company, this success, this incredible partnership with Claire, I earned. Nobody handed me anything. Nobody paved my way. I'm proof that in America, if you work hard enough and want it badly enough, you can build something from nothing." The room erupted in applause. From nothing. He said it twice. From nothing. I stood 10 feet behind him holding a tray of champagne glasses, and I remembered the fire. The apartment filled with smoke. Evan crying in his bedroom, 7 years old and terrified. My shoulder hitting the burning beam as I carried him out. The emergency room. The bandages. The smell of antiseptic covering the smell of smoke. Nora's wedding ring. The small gold band from 1976 that she wore until her fingers got too thin from the cancer. Sold to a pawn shop for $2,800 to cover Evan's private school fees when the scholarship didn't quite stretch far enough. 15 years of double shifts, working Jefferson High cafeteria during the day, catering on weekends, night security 3 times a week. Coming home at 2 in the morning, smelling like fryer grease and floor wax, setting an alarm for 5:30 because the breakfast shift started at 6. From nothing, from absolute zero, the glasses on my tray clinked together. My hands were shaking. A woman at the nearest table looked over, her expression mildly annoyed by the noise. I smiled apologetically and stepped back a little, pressing myself closer to the wall. Evan was still talking, saying something about gratitude and partnership and building a future together, but I couldn't hear the words anymore. Just the phrase on repeat in my head, from nothing, from nothing, from nothing. I stepped back into the service hallway, away from the tables, away from the applause and the speeches and the celebration of my son's success that had been built on a foundation he'd decided didn't exist. My hand went to my chest. My heart was pounding against my ribs hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. The old burn scar tissue pulled tight under my collar with each breath. I leaned against the wall, tray still in my hands, and tried to remember how to breathe normally. Inside the ballroom, Evan's voice continued. Laughter rippled through the crowd at something he said. Claire stood and kissed him, and 200 people applauded. I stood in the hallway with my hand on my chest. My heart was pounding. The moment someone finally sees you, after hours of being invisible, is not relief, it's exposure. I pushed myself off the hallway wall and walked back toward the cocktail area near the exit where guests were lingering between dinner courses. My heart had stopped pounding quite so hard, but my hands still weren't completely steady. I picked up a tray of coffee cups and moved through the tables, offering refills, keeping my eyes down. That's when I felt someone staring. An older man at a corner table, 70s white hair, expensive suit that looked comfortable rather than showy, was watching me with the expression of someone placing a memory. I'd learned to ignore those looks over the years. People thought they recognized cafeteria workers all the time, usually confusing us with other service staff they'd encountered and forgotten. But this man didn't look away. When I approached his table, he spoke quietly. "Excuse me, did you used to work at Jefferson High?" I stopped. "Yes, sir. 31 years. His face lit with recognition, not the polite kind, but genuine. "I thought so. My grandson used to eat your lunches. He always talked about the cafeteria man who saved him a tray on Fridays." He paused. "Samuel Price. I used to be county mayor's office back before I retired." That's where I knew the name from. The VIP list, the one that had seemed vaguely familiar when I'd first seen it on the briefing. "Your grandson turned out okay?" I asked, because that's what you say when someone tells you they remember. "He did. Thanks in part to you, I think." Samuel Price smiled, but it faded as his eyes moved past me toward the front of the room, where Evan was standing with wedding guests. Then he looked back at me, and I watched understanding dawn on his face, the kind of understanding that changes the shape of a conversation. "Are you related to the groom?" My throat closed. The coffee cups on my tray rattled slightly. 3 words came out, the shortest sentence I've ever had to say out loud. "I am his father." Samuel Price looked at me for a long time. Then he looked toward Evan, who was laughing at something Claire had just said, his arm around her waist, his face glowing with the particular happiness of someone who believes his life is exactly what he deserves. When Price looked back at me, I saw in his face something I didn't want to see. Something worse than confusion or surprise. "Pity." "I see," he said quietly. And the way he said it told me he did see all of it. The server's vest, the tray in my hands, the fact that I was standing at the edge of my son's wedding, being paid by the hour while Evan declared himself self-made. I gestured vaguely toward the other tables. "Coffee." "Of course." But he didn't stop looking at me with that expression that made my chest hurt worse than the heart-pounding had. I moved away quickly, and I could feel the knowledge spreading. Price leaned toward his wife, whispered something. She turned to look at me, her hand going to her mouth. At the next table, someone who'd overheard asked a quiet question. More whispers, more glances. I am his father. 3 words, and the one that hurt the most. Because saying it to a stranger at my son's wedding while wearing a server's vest means it's both completely true and completely meaningless at the same time. That's when I saw Claire moving toward me. She was elegant in her wedding dress, every movement precise and calculated. Her smile was perfect, the kind that looked warm from a distance and cold up close. She approached me in the corner of the banquet hall, where I'd retreated with my empty tray, her voice low enough that nearby guests couldn't hear. Mr. Bennett? Not Harold, not Evan's father. Just Mr. Bennett with the same tone you'd use for any service worker whose name you'd checked off a list. You're working tonight. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. A reminder of my place. I looked her straight in the eye. My son is getting married. And you're on the clock, she said, her smile never wavering. I suggest you keep it professional. The words hit like cold water. Professional. As if acknowledging my own son would be unprofessional. As if existing in his life beyond the capacity of hired help was a breach of contract. Does he know? I asked. Does Evan know I'm here? Her eyes held mine, and for half a second I saw something flicker there. Not quite satisfaction, not quite cruelty. Something in between. Mr. Bennett, I think you should focus on your assigned duties. The guests need attention. She turned and walked back toward the head table, her dress trailing behind her, and I stood there understanding it all. She knew. She had always known. This was the plan. Every piece clicked into place with sickening clarity. The dinner 8 months ago where she'd studied my burn scar like she was taking notes. The vague company name on the briefing, Bennett Capital Events, LLC, familiar enough that I didn't question it, vague enough that I didn't recognize it as Evan's company. The catering assignment offered through Martin Cole presented as just another high-dollar client. She had searched for my catering company the night we met, found out where I worked, waited 6 months, then hired me not to include me, but to position me exactly where she wanted present, at the wedding, but categorized as staff, visible but invisible close enough to see everything but far enough that I didn't matter. This wasn't exclusion. Exclusion would have been easier. This was orchestrated humiliation. This was 8 months of planning to ensure that when Evan stood at a microphone, declaring himself self-made from nothing, his father would be standing 10 feet away holding a tray of champagne glasses. I understood it all in a second. Bennett Capital familiar enough not to suspect, vague enough not to recognize. She hired me. She put me here. Across the room, Claire stood beside Evan, her hand on his arm, whispering something that made him smile. And I realized that she'd won not by erasing me from the wedding, but by rewriting my role in it. I wasn't missing. I was just reclassified. From father to food service. From family to hired help. From everything to nothing while being forced to watch. My son walked toward me across the banquet hall, and for half a second I forgot I was wearing a server's vest. For half a second I was just a father watching his son approach, and maybe he was coming to find me because he'd realized I was here, because someone had told him, because he wanted to fix this impossible situation before it became unfixable. Then I remembered Claire's cold voice. I remembered the way she'd said, "on the clock," like it was a threat. And I understood that Evan wasn't walking toward me to apologize. He was walking toward me to manage a problem. We stood face to face in the side hallway near the kitchen door. Him in his custom tuxedo, perfectly tailored, his hair styled, his boutonniere fresh. Me in my server's vest with the catering company logo, my collar buttoned high to cover the scar, my hands still smelling like the industrial soap from the kitchen. The first time in nearly 2 years we'd been this close. I asked very softly, keeping my voice low so the guests nearby wouldn't hear, "Did you know I would be here?" He didn't answer immediately. "Son?" I said, and my voice broke slightly on the word. "Did you not invite me to your own wedding?" Evan's jaw tightened. When he spoke, his voice wasn't a son's voice. It was the voice of someone who'd learned to handle difficult situations in boardrooms and investor meetings. "Dad, this isn't a good time." "When is a good time, Evan?" Silence. He looked past me toward the banquet hall, where his wedding reception was continuing without him, where Claire was probably watching this conversation from a distance, where 200 guests were eating dinner and drinking champagne, and celebrating a man who declared himself self-made. Then Evan turned slightly and spoke to Martin Cole, who'd appeared behind me in the hallway. His voice was calm, professional, the voice of someone giving instructions to service staff. Please have this staff member escorted out. Not Dad. Not Mr. Bennett. This staff member. The words hung in the air between us for a moment that felt like an hour. I watched my son's face, looking for something. Anything that suggested he understood what he'd just said, what he'd just done. But his expression was closed, controlled the face of someone who'd already moved on to the next item on his agenda. Ray Collins appeared beside me, 44 years old, in his hotel security uniform, his expression apologetic, even as he did his job. Sir, he said quietly, I need you to come with me. I followed without resistance. What was I going to do? Argue, make a scene at my son's wedding, force him to acknowledge me in front of his wife's family and his business associates, and the 200 people who just applauded his speech about building himself from nothing. I walked. Ray led me through the service hallway, past the kitchen entrance toward the back exit. The wedding music grew fainter. The laughter and conversation faded to a distant murmur. My footsteps echoed on the tile floor. That's when the tin box of cornbread fell from my apron pocket. It hit the floor with a metallic clatter, the lid coming off the small square of cornbread, spilling out onto the tiles. I stopped and looked down at it, the cornbread I'd baked that morning, because sometimes when I bake cornbread, I think of Evan, because I'd thought maybe if I saw him I could give him a piece, remind him of something good, Sir Ray said, waiting. I looked at the box lying there on the tiled floor next to the garbage can, next to the service entrance. I had baked it that morning because sometimes when I bake cornbread, I think of Evan. But Evan wasn't thinking of me. Evan was inside dancing with his new wife, while I stood in a service hallway being escorted out by security. I didn't pick it up. I don't know why. Maybe because I understood that there are things once they've fallen that don't need to be picked up again. Ray led me out the back door, and it closed behind me with a soft click that sounded final. I stood in the darkness next to the dumpster and the trash cans, the September night air cool on my face. Inside, the wedding music continued. I could hear it faintly through the walls. Laughter, the clink of glasses, the celebration of my son's marriage to a woman who'd spent 8 months planning my humiliation. I sat down on the back steps. I didn't leave immediately. I just sat there in the darkness, still wearing the server's vest, my hands resting on my knees. The music drifted out through the ventilation systems, and the loading dock entrance first, the upbeat reception songs, then the quieter dinner music, then the louder dancing music as the night went on. I looked at my hands in the dim light from the security lamp above the door. The burn scars were visible even in shadow, pale lines running from my wrist up my forearm, the tissue shiny and smooth where the beam had caught me that night, 27 years ago, when I'd carried a 7-year-old boy out of smoke and fire. I looked at the crushed cornbread box on the ground near the dumpster, the contents scattered already starting to attract ants. I didn't cry. I just sat. 69 years is a long time to wait to understand that love is not the same as being loved. That sacrifice is not the same as gratitude. That you can give someone your entire life, and they can still look at you like you're a stranger they need removed from the room. Nora had known. She'd written it in her letter. 15 years ago, you love Evan, in such a way that you forget you need to be loved too. And I'd kept that letter in a glass cabinet and never opened it again because I was afraid she was right. She was right. Time passed. I don't know how much. The music changed from fast songs to slow songs. Voices rose and fell. Once the back door opened and kitchen staff came out with trash, glancing at me, sitting on the steps but not saying anything. At 9 o'clock the music changed to a slow dance, something soft and romantic, probably Evan and Claire's first dance as husband and wife. I stood up, brushed off my clothes, walked toward the bus stop at the edge of the hotel parking lot. I didn't look back at the hotel. I didn't need to. I'd seen enough. It was 11 o'clock when I got home, and the apartment had never felt this quiet. I didn't change out of the server's vest. I just walked in, locked the door behind me, and stood in the kitchen looking at nothing in particular. The light above the sink was still on from that morning from when I'd baked the cornbread that was now crushed on a hotel floor next to a dumpster. That morning felt like it had happened to a different person. I sat down at the kitchen table, and my eyes went to the glass cabinet where they always went when I needed to see something that mattered. Nora's wedding ring sat there, catching the dim light. and beside it, the letter. 15 years I'd kept it folded in that cabinet. Read it once the day after her funeral, then never again. I reached out and opened the cabinet door, took the letter out. The paper was thin, fragile, the way paper gets when it's old and has been handled carefully. Her handwriting was still visible through the folds. Blue ink precise loops, the penmanship of someone who believed words should be chosen with care. I unfolded it. The first part I remembered the part about loving Evan in a way that made me forget I needed to be loved too. But there was more. There was always more, and I'd been too afraid to remember it. Harold, she'd written, if the day comes when Evan no longer needs you, and it will come because that's what children do, they grow up in a way, promise me you won't disappear into the waiting. Promise me you'll still be here. Not for him. For yourself. For me. Don't spend the rest of your life standing in rooms hoping someone will notice you're there. I'm noticing you. I've always noticed you. And wherever I am when you read this, I'm still noticing. I read it 3 times. The third time I had to stop because my hands were shaking and the words were blurring. I put the letter down on the table next to Nora's ring, and I thought she knew. She had always known. Not just that Evan would leave, that was inevitable, that was normal. That was what children do when they become adults. But she'd known that I would disappear into the space he left behind. That I would make myself smaller and smaller until I was just waiting, just hoping, just standing in hallways with trays in my hands, asking permission to exist. And she'd still love me enough to write this down, to tell me 15 years before I'd need to hear it that I had no right to disappear. I folded the letter carefully and placed my hand on my chest, feeling my heart beat steady and slow. Outside the city was quiet. Inside I was quieter. But I was here, still here. I tried to sleep, couldn't. Lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the evening over and over, Evan's voice saying, this staff member, the cornbread box, hitting the floor, the 90 minutes, sitting in the dark next to the trash cans. Around 6 in the morning, my phone started buzzing. Once, twice. Then continuously a steady vibration that didn't stop. I picked it up and saw messages from numbers I didn't recognize. Dozens of them. Then hundreds. The screen kept lighting up with notifications I didn't understand. I opened the messaging app and clicked on one. I'm so sorry this happened to you. Another one, you deserved better. Another, your son should be ashamed. I didn't understand. How did these people know? How did they have my number? Then I saw the link someone had sent. A video. I clicked it. 90 seconds. Filmed from a phone hidden in an apron pocket. The angle awkward and shaky. But the audio. Clear. The side hallway of the Lakeside Grand Hotel. Me standing in my server's vest. Evan in his tuxedo, his voice calm and professional. Please have this staff member escorted out. Ray Collins appearing, me following. The tin box of cornbread falling to the floor with that metallic clatter. The video ended with a shot of the crushed box lying next to the trash can. The caption read, this man served food at his own son's wedding. He didn't know he was invited as the help. Posted by Denise Walker at 2 a.m. I looked at the view count. 2,147,832. In 6 hours. While I'd been lying awake staring at my ceiling, 2 million people had watched the worst moment of my life. I scrolled through the comments. Thousands of them. Strangers I'd never met defending me, condemning Evan, sharing their own stories of being erased by family, of being treated like they didn't matter, of loving people who didn't love them back. This breaks my heart. Someone find this man and give him a hug. The son is disgusting. Imagine being this cruel to your own father. I hope Harold knows that millions of people see him. We see you. My phone kept buzzing. More messages. More notifications. News sites were picking it up. Now I could see the headlines forming in my notifications. Elderly father forced to serve at son's wedding. Viral video shows ultimate family betrayal. Wedding humiliation sparks outrage. I sat on the edge of my bed in the gray morning light, still wearing yesterday's clothes. Phone glowing in my hands, and tried to process what was happening. Denise had filmed it. She'd hidden her phone in her apron pocket and captured the whole thing. Not just Evan's words, but the aftermath. The removal. The cornbread box. She'd posted it in the middle of the night. And while I slept, the internet had turned my private shame into something else. I looked at the screen, at the number that kept climbing. 2,153,000 now, growing every few seconds. I don't understand how the internet works. I don't understand viral videos or hashtags or trending topics. But I understand one thing clearly, sitting there in my small apartment while the sun comes up over Nashville. What happened last night is no longer my private matter. 2 million people saw my son reduce me to this staff member. 2 million people saw the cornbread box fall. 2 million people now know what Claire and Evan did. And I don't know what happens next, but I know this: I can't disappear anymore. Nora told me not to, and now the world won't let me. By 10 o'clock Monday morning, someone had leaked the email that proved everything. I was still sitting at my kitchen table, phone in hand, watching the view count climb 2,300,000, now more, every minute, when a new link appeared in my messages. Someone I didn't know had sent it with just 2 words: "Read this." I clicked it. An email, screenshot posted to the same platform where Denise had shared her video. The header showed it was sent 3 weeks before the wedding from Claire Whitmore to Martin Cole at the catering company. The text was short, clinical, precise. If a man identifying himself as father of the groom appears among staff, escort him out immediately via service exit. Do not allow contact with wedding party. Maintain discretion. See Whitmore. I stared at the screen. Read it again. If a man identifying himself as father of the groom. Not if Harold Bennett appears. Not if my father-in-law is working. Just a man identifying himself as father of the groom, as if my relationship to Evan was a claim I might make, not a fact of his existence. She knew my name. We'd had dinner together 8 months ago. She'd studied my burn scar like she was taking inventory. She knew exactly who I was. And she'd written this email 3 weeks before the wedding, before I even knew what event I'd be working, before Martin handed me the briefing folder with Bennett Capital Events, LLC, printed on the cover. She'd planned it. Every detail. The vague company name that I wouldn't question. The assignment offered as weekend overtime. The instructions to remove me the moment I appeared. All of it calculated to put me in that hallway, wearing a server's vest, while my son declared himself self-made. I read the email a 3rd time, and this time I noticed the timestamp. The leak had come from Martin Cole's personal email account, posted 20 minutes ago with a caption that said simply, "I followed orders. I'm done following orders." Martin, the man who'd stood beside Evan and said, "Please have this staff member escorted out," without questioning why. The man who'd spent 20 years in the catering business, learning not to ask questions, not to get involved, just to do the job and collect the paycheck. He'd leaked Claire's email. He'd made himself a witness. And now everyone could see what I'd only just understood. This wasn't a misunderstanding or an oversight or an unfortunate coincidence. This was premeditated. My phone buzzed with new messages. The internet was doing what the internet does, spreading the email, analyzing it, quoting specific phrases, building a narrative that even I couldn't deny anymore. Claire Whitmore had orchestrated my humiliation weeks in advance, and my son had let her do it. I set the phone down and looked at my hands. They were steady. That surprised me. I thought they'd be shaking. Around 2 o'clock the response came. Not from Evan, not from Claire, from the Whitmore family lawyers. I saw it first as a news alert. Whitmore family responds to viral wedding video controversy. Then as screenshots of legal documents being shared across social media. Cease and desist letters sent to Denise Walker and Martin Cole, threatening lawsuits for unauthorized recording and distribution of private event footage, and breach of confidentiality agreements. The catering company received a letter too demanding Denise's immediate termination, and there was a public statement released through a spokesperson carefully worded by people who understood that admitting nothing was the best defense. The Whitmore family regrets an unfortunate misunderstanding caused by an emotional employee who violated her professional obligations. The family requests privacy during this difficult time and will pursue all legal remedies available to protect their reputation. No mention of Harold by name, no acknowledgement of relationship, no admission of wrongdoing, just an unfortunate misunderstanding and an emotional employee, and requests privacy, the language of people who believed money and lawyers could make anything disappear. How do you fight people with lawyers when you're a 69-year-old cafeteria worker with nothing but the truth? How do you protect people who protected you when they have everything to lose and you have nothing left? My phone rang at 4 o'clock. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick it up. "Mr. Harold, Denise Walker. Her voice was shaking. They're going to sue me, she said. The Whitmores sent a letter to my apartment. They're threatening legal action. And my boss called. They want me fired. They said if the company doesn't terminate me, they'll sue them too. I sat down at the kitchen table. I'm so sorry, she continued, and now I could hear her crying. I didn't think I just saw what happened, and I couldn't. Mr. Harold, I can't afford a lawyer. I'm paying for school. I can't. Denise, I said quietly. Stop, breathe. She went quiet except for the sound of her trying to control her breathing. I remembered her. Not just from last night, not just from the service corridor where she'd asked if I was okay, but from 15 years ago. 12 years old, arriving late to the Jefferson High cafeteria because she'd stayed after class to finish a makeup test. Walking into an empty room where all the lunch trays were cleared, except one, the one I'd saved for her. The way I saved one every Friday for the kids who came last. You used to save me a tray, she'd said yesterday, like it was a small thing, like it hadn't mattered. But it had mattered. It had mattered enough that she remembered. Enough that when she saw me being removed from my son's wedding, she'd filmed it because she couldn't let it happen in silence. Denise, I said, I'm not going to let you suffer consequences for telling the truth. But they have lawyers. They have money. You're not just anything, I said. You did the right thing, and I promise you we'll figure this out. I didn't know how. I didn't know what I could do against the Whitmore family and their law firm and their carefully worded statements. But I knew one thing. I couldn't let her suffer for protecting me. I couldn't let Martin Cole lose everything for finally choosing conscience over orders. 2 million people had seen what happened. The Whitmores could threaten lawsuits and fire employees and release statements about unfortunate misunderstandings. But they couldn't make 2 million people unsee the truth. How much is your conscience worth in dollars? 2 million people had watched what happened. Denise and Martin were facing lawsuits, and somewhere in Nashville, a woman I'd never met was about to answer that question. Lydia Ross sat in her photography studio Monday afternoon at 4 o'clock when her phone rang. The caller ID showed Claire Whitmore's number. I didn't know this at the time. I learned it later the way you learn about kindness, after it's already happened from someone else, in pieces reconstructed from what they were willing to say. Claire's voice was cold and controlled. Lydia, I need you to publicly confirm that the photos show nothing unusual, and I need the originals deleted. Silence on the line. I'll double your contract for next year, Claire continued. All Whitmore family events. That's a significant increase to your annual income. Lydia sat at her laptop. On the screen were the unedited wedding photos, the ones she'd taken before the official portrait selections, before anyone knew what moments would need to be erased. There I was, frozen mid-step holding a tray, my face caught. In that moment of recognition when I'd first seen Evan across the room, and there was Evan looking directly at me, not past me, not through me, but at me with an expression that made it clear this wasn't surprise. This was acknowledgement. And in the background, slightly blurred but unmistakable, Claire gesturing sharply to Martin Cole, her hand motion precise, commanding. These photos told the story Claire wanted erased. Lydia thought about her business. She was freelance, had been for 8 years. The Whitmore contract was 30% of her annual income. Losing it meant tighter months, fewer equipment upgrades, maybe taking jobs she didn't want just to keep the lights on. But she kept staring at one photo, my face, the look of a man being erased while everyone watched. After a long silence, Lydia hung up without answering. She opened her email client, attached every original photo from the wedding, all 347 of them, addressed the message to 3 Nashville newspapers, wrote a one-line note, from the Bennett Whitmore wedding, unedited originals, sent it. Lydia Ross had never met me. She photographed my son's wedding and saw a man in a server's vest, standing frozen while his world collapsed. And she chose to lose money rather than let that moment disappear. How do you thank someone for that? How do you repay someone who sacrifices their livelihood to prove you existed? The photos hit the newspaper's inboxes at 4:45 p.m. By 5:32 of them had published selections online. By 6 o'clock, the images were everywhere, proof that what Denise filmed wasn't an isolated moment, but a sustained reality captured from multiple angles across an entire evening. Before I tell you what happened next, about the voice that would change everything I need to know, if you're still with me, comment A if you think Harold should accept help from strangers, Or B, if he should handle this alone and tell me why in one short sentence. Please note what follows includes some recreated details, added for emotional impact. What matters is the lesson behind it. Then at 6 o'clock, Samuel Price posted. I was sitting at my kitchen table, phone in hand, watching the photos spread across the internet, journalists sharing them, strangers analyzing them, comparing angles and timestamps to reconstruct exactly what had happened and when. That's when someone sent me a link with the message, "Former mayor is defending you." I clicked it. Samuel Price had posted on his social media account, the one he'd maintained since his retirement, the one followed by thousands of people who remembered his 40 years of public service in Nashville. His post read, "I was at that wedding. I spoke to Harold Bennett in person. This man served lunches at Jefferson High cafeteria for 31 years. My grandson ate his food every day for 4 years. He always told me about the cafeteria man who saved him a tray on Fridays when he stayed late for tutoring. Harold Bennett is not an emotional employee. He is a father who was deliberately humiliated by his son and daughter-in-law at what should have been a family celebration." I watched it happen. I saw his face, and I'm ashamed I didn't speak up in that moment. Samuel Price, former county mayor, 40 years of public service, a name people in Nashville knew, trusted, respected. He remembered me, he remembered that I fed children, and he used his name, his reputation, built over 4 decades, to defend mine. Because Price was a known figure, his post did what Denise's video and Lydia's photos couldn't do alone. It made the story legitimate. It transformed a viral moment into something journalists could investigate, verify, build articles around. Within an hour, reporters were calling the school district, requesting my employment records. Local news stations were interviewing former students, adults, now with careers and families who remembered Mr. Harold, who always had extra trays, and the cafeteria guy who knew everyone's name, and that quiet man who worked there forever. My phone kept buzzing, messages from numbers I didn't recognize. Some were journalists asking for interviews. More were strangers, people I'd fed 20 years ago, people whose children I'd fed 10 years ago, people who'd moved away from Nashville and were now seeing my face on the internet and remembering. One message read, "Mr. Bennett, I was in your cafeteria line in 2003. You always gave me extra vegetables because you knew I was trying to gain weight for football. You probably don't remember me, but I remember you, and I'm so sorry this happened." Another, "My daughter had food allergies. You kept a separate section for her meals for 3 years. You saved her life more times than you knew. Thank you." Another, "You fed me when my mom couldn't. Every day for 4 years. I never forgot." I sat at my kitchen table reading these messages as the sun set outside my window, and I realized something I'd never understood before. The Whitmores tried to erase one man. They were discovering you can't erase someone thousands of people remember feeding their children. People found me, not because I wanted to be found, but because the truth finds its way out when enough people can't sleep. Tuesday morning, my phone rang before sunrise, a reporter asking if I'd sold my wife's wedding ring to pay for college tuition. I sat up in bed, still half asleep, and said yes before I'd fully processed the question. Then I asked how she knew. "Public records," she said. Her voice was professional efficient. "Pawn shop transaction from 1999, $2,800. The timing coincides with your son's 3rd year at Princeton. Can you confirm that's accurate?" "Yes," I said again, because what else was there to say? "And can you confirm you were treated for 2nd-degree burns at Vanderbilt Medical Center in September 1996? I closed my eyes. "Yes." "Hospital records indicate the burns were sustained while rescuing someone from a residential fire. Was that someone your son—" "He was 7. He doesn't remember much from that time. But he's claimed in multiple interviews that he built everything alone. Mr. Bennett, you were working 3 jobs when he attended Princeton: security guard, weekend construction, and cafeteria work. That's 72 hours a week, according to employment records. Did your son ever acknowledge this publicly?" I opened my eyes and looked at the ceiling. Dawn was just starting to brighten the edges of my bedroom window. "No," I said quietly. "He never did." That was the first call. There were 40 more before noon. Journalists had done what journalists do. They dug. Employment records from 3 different employers between 1995 and 2010. Pay stubs showing overlapping shifts. The pawn shop receipt with Nora's ring itemized as 14-karat gold wedding band, size 6 minor wear. Hospital admission records from the night of the fire, including photographs of my burns that I'd never seen and didn't want to see now. And they'd cross-referenced everything with Evan's public statements. 23 interviews, 4 speeches, all containing some version of the same narrative. I built this from nothing. Nobody handed me anything. I'm proof that in America, if you work hard enough, you can create your own success story. By Tuesday afternoon, major outlets were publishing timelines, side-by-side comparisons. Evan's claims on one side documented evidence on the other. The narrative wasn't just contradicted, it was demolished. I spread the printed articles across my kitchen table. There was my 1999 work schedule, obtained somehow from employer archives, showing 72 hours a week across 3 jobs. And beside it, a quote from Evan's 2019 interview with a business magazine. My father taught me nothing about hard work. I learned that on my own. I stared at those words for a long time. My phone kept vibrating. Reporters wanting comments. Former co-workers saying they'd been contacted for verification. Strangers who'd read the articles and wanted me to know they believed me. They saw me. They understood. The coffee I'd made that morning had gone cold hours ago. I didn't make more. I just sat there reading about my own life as if it had happened to someone else, watching my private sacrifices become public evidence in a case I'd never wanted to make. Did Evan forget, or did he choose not to remember? That was the question I couldn't answer. The question that kept me awake at night even before any of this started. Maybe both were true. Maybe forgetting and choosing are the same thing when it comes to the stories we tell about ourselves. Wednesday morning, my phone rang again. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick it up. Mr. Bennett, a man's voice, smooth and rehearsed. My name is calling on behalf of the family. They would like to arrange a meeting, a gesture of reconciliation. I sat down at the kitchen table. Which family? I asked. Silence on the other end. Long enough that I could hear papers shuffling. I am calling on behalf of concerned parties who believe a conversation could be beneficial for all involved. You didn't answer my question, I said. Which family? My family, or his wife's family. More shuffling. The smooth tone cracked slightly. Mr. Bennett, I think there's been some confusion. Let me clarify. My phone vibrated in my hand. Another call coming in. I glanced at the screen. 610 area code, mainline Philadelphia, where the Whitmores lived. I let it go to voicemail. You don't even know who you're representing, do you? I said to the man on the phone. You just got handed a script and a phone number. They didn't tell you I'm Evan's father. They didn't tell you anything except to call Mr. Bennett and offer reconciliation. Sir, I assure you, just tell them I'm not a photo opportunity, I said and hung up. The voicemail notification chimed. I listened to it. A different voice, female, equally rehearsed. Mr. Bennett, this is regarding a time-sensitive opportunity to discuss your family situation. Please return this call at your earliest convenience. Then a text message appeared. Important matter regarding Bennett family. Please respond. I set the phone down on the table and looked at the stack of articles still spread out in front of me. Proof of everything I'd given. Proof of everything Evan had erased from his carefully constructed origin story. The Whitmores wanted a photo, some staged moment of reconciliation that they could use to repair Evan's reputation and their family's image. Victor Hale. I'd learned his name later. The crisis PR consultant they'd hired had probably told them exactly what it was worth, $10 million in brand recovery, maybe more. And they'd sent someone to call me who didn't even know whether I was Evan's father or Claire's father-in-law. Someone who had to consult his script when I asked a simple question. Someone who'd been told to refer to me as Mr. Bennett and concerned parties, because giving me an actual relationship father-family person would make it harder to use me as a prop. The public wanted a story. The Whitmores wanted damage control. The journalists wanted verification and quotes and exclusive interviews. But nobody had asked what I wanted. Nobody, except the people who'd already sacrificed something to tell the truth. Denise, who was facing a lawsuit. Martin, who'd leaked the email that ended his career with that catering company. Lydia, who'd lost 30% of her income to send those photos. Samuel Price, who'd used his reputation to defend mine. They'd asked nothing of me. They'd just acted because it was right. I picked up my phone and looked at the text message again. Important matter regarding Bennett family. I deleted it. Then I opened my contacts and found a number I'd saved but never called. The reporter from Tuesday morning, the one who'd asked about the ring. I typed, "If you want to know what I want, I'll tell you, but I'm not doing a photo op." The intermediary slid a folded paper across the coffee shop table, a number with 6 zeros that was supposed to make me forget everything. Thursday morning, 4 days after the wedding. The coffee shop was small, tucked into a corner of downtown Nashville, the kind of place where nobody would recognize me even though my face had been on the internet for the past week. Derek Walsh had chosen it carefully. He was a professional at this, making uncomfortable conversations feel casual, transactional business feel personal. He was 40-something, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, with the kind of smooth voice that came from years of delivering messages other people didn't want to say themselves. "Mr. Bennett," he began, his hands folded on the table between us, "the family recognizes this situation has been difficult. They understand emotions are running high on all sides." I sipped my coffee and said nothing. "They're prepared to offer $150,000 as a gesture of goodwill, contingent on your participation in a brief reconciliation event." He pushed the folded paper closer to me. I didn't touch it. "The event would be simple," he continued. "A family dinner. Photographers present, but approved in advance. You and your son, a few words exchanged, a photograph of you embracing. Pre-approved statements to the press emphasizing mutual understanding and family healing." I finished my coffee, set the cup down carefully in its saucer. "The compensation reflects the family's acknowledgement of your discomfort," Walsh said, and the way he hesitated on that word told me he'd workshopped it, practiced it, decided discomfort was safer than humiliation or pain or any of the words that would have been accurate. "And of course," he added, "there would be a non-disclosure agreement regarding the details of the arrangement." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I looked at the folded paper with its 6-figure number that was supposed to buy my dignity back, or more accurately, rent it for an evening so the Whitmores could take a photograph worth 10 times that amount. "Tell them I don't need their money," I said quietly. "Tell them I'm not a prop." I stood. Walsh's coffee cup rattled slightly in its saucer, surprise, maybe fear. "Mr. Bennett, please, there's a reconsideration window if you'd like to discuss terms." I pulled out my wallet, left exact change for my coffee on the table, and walked out while he was mid-sentence. Behind me, I heard him say something else, but I was already at the door. I'd spent 69 years being the person who didn't make a scene, who accepted what was offered, who said yes to overtime and double shifts, and would you mind, and if it's not too much trouble. I'd spent my whole life being grateful for scraps. But there are some things you can't accept without losing the last part of yourself that matters. Friday afternoon, I was at home when my phone started buzzing with a new round of notifications. Another article, another leak. This time, it wasn't about me. It was about them. Ashley Kern. I'd never heard the name before. She ran an investigative blog that focused on corporate malfeasance and PR spin. Apparently, Victor Hale, the crisis consultant the Whitmores had hired, had made a mistake. He'd tried to get ahead of my refusal by feeding her a story. Something about how Harold Bennett had refused reasonable compensation, but continued engaging with media for attention. How the family had tried, in good faith, to reconcile, and I'd rejected them. But Ashley Kern didn't just publish press releases, she fact-checked. She'd found inconsistencies in Victor's story, reached out to him for clarification, and Victor, apparently believing she was a friendly outlet, had sent her an email chain explaining the full PR strategy. She published everything. The email subject line glowed on my phone screen: ROI analysis, Bennett reconciliation event. ROI, return on investment, not on relationship, on investment. Victor's memo to the Whitmore family, sent 2 days before Derek Walsh met me at that coffee shop. Conservative estimate, single image of Harold Bennett. Forgiving Evan delivers $10 million in brand value recovery within Q4. Recommended compensation range $100,000 to $200,000. Net value to client $9.8 million minimum. I read it 3 times. Then I read Ashley Kern's analysis beneath it. This wasn't an apology. This was a transaction. The Whitmores calculated Harold Bennett's forgiveness as a $10 million brand asset. They offered him $150,000, 1.5% of what they valued it at. They weren't seeking reconciliation. They were seeking a discount on damage control. Within an hour, her blog post was everywhere. News outlets were quoting it. Social media was sharing it. The math was simple enough that anyone could understand $150,000 offered $10 million expected value. The Whitmores had put a price tag on my dignity, and they'd tried to get it at a 98% markdown. Victor Hale tried to contain it. His firm released a statement claiming the memo was taken out of context and reflected preliminary analysis not approved by clients. But the internet had already done what the internet does. It archived everything, screenshot. Everything made it impossible to unsay. By Friday night, the leaked emails had been shared 400,000 times. Evan's PR team issued a statement distancing him from Victor Hale. They claimed Evan had not been aware of the transactional language used by outside consultants and was deeply troubled by the characterization of family matters as ROI analysis. But the damage was done. Everyone could see it now. The photo op wasn't about apology or healing or even basic human decency. It was about brand management, about calculating the cost-benefit of my forgiveness, like it was a marketing campaign. I sat at my kitchen table reading the coverage, watching the story spread, and I thought about Derek Walsh's smooth voice in that coffee shop, the folded paper with 6 zeros, the reconsideration window. I don't know who Victor Hale is. I never hired him. Never asked him to defend me or leak emails or expose anything, but he did something I could never have done alone. He proved I was right to walk away. He showed everyone exactly what the Whitmores thought I was worth, not as a father, not as a person, but as an asset in their crisis management strategy. And he did it by accident, by being so confident in his own expertise that he forgot the most important rule: never put in writing what you don't want the world to see. Friday afternoon, Lydia called to tell me Evan's Series B funding had collapsed, $47 million gone, because investors didn't want to be associated with a man who calculated his father's worth at 1.5%. I was sitting at my kitchen table when the phone rang. Lydia Ross, the photographer who'd lost the Whitmore contract to send those unedited photos to the newspapers. "Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice carrying that particular energy people have when they've been following a story and need to share breaking news. "I thought you should know. Evan's investors pulled out. The Series B round, it's dead." "How do you know?" "I still have contacts in that world. The lead investor called Evan this afternoon, told him the board couldn't move forward given the reputational concerns. It happened fast, within hours of Victor's emails going viral. $47 million gone." I tried to picture it. Evan sitting in his Nashville office, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown, receiving a call that unmade months of work, years of building all the promises he'd made to employees and partners and himself. Lydia filled in what she'd heard David Brennan, the lead investor, had called personally. "Out of respect," he'd said. The conversation was professional, brief, devastating. "Evan, I'm calling personally out of respect. We need to pause the term sheet. The board has serious concerns about reputational risk in the current environment." Evan would have tried to salvage it. "I know my son." He'd have said it was a PR issue, that it would pass, that the fundamentals hadn't changed. But David Brennan, a venture capitalist who'd seen 1,000 pitches and evaluated 1,000 founders, would have been unmoved. "The fundamentals include founder character assessment. Right now, that assessment has material questions we can't overlook. I'm sorry." Claire would have been there. She was always there for the important calls, the crucial meetings, the moments when Evan's business became their shared project. I imagined her sitting across from him in that office, watching him end the call, watching the laptop screen where the pending deal now showed as dead. Claire Whitmore, who'd orchestrated a wedding like a military campaign, who'd planned my humiliation with the precision of a corporate strategist, who'd probably calculated exactly how many guests would need to witness my removal. To maximize the message, she'd be sitting motionless, a general watching her army dissolve in real time. "Thank you for telling me," I said to Lydia. "I'm not celebrating it," she said quickly. "I just thought you should know that actions have consequences, even for people who think money protects them from consequences." After we hung up, I sat at the table for a long time. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt tired. $47 million. A number so large it stopped meaning anything. Evan had built Bennett Capital from nothing, from actual nothing, despite what his speeches claimed, and now it was crumbling, because he'd forgotten where nothing actually started. Saturday morning, I went to the diner near Jefferson High, the same one I'd eaten at for 31 years, the one where the coffee was always slightly burned, and the waitress knew I took mine black. I needed to be somewhere familiar, somewhere that remembered me before any of this happened. That's where Martin Cole found me. He walked in looking smaller than I remembered. At the wedding, he'd been the manager, the one giving orders, the one Evan had turned to when he needed this staff member removed. Now he just looked like a middle-aged man who hadn't slept well in a week. "Mr. Bennett," he said, standing beside my booth. "Can I sit?" I nodded. He sat down across from me, looking at his hands the way people do when they're working up courage to say something difficult. "I didn't know who you were," he said finally. "At the wedding. I just knew I had orders. Walk you out, keep it dignified, don't make a scene. I've been in this business 20 years. I've always told myself I just follow instructions. That's the job you do, what the client asks you. Don't get involved, you collect your paycheck and go home." "I know," I said. "You were kind about it." He looked up at me surprised. "I was kind. You could have been rough. You weren't. You did your job. I don't blame you for that. You should," he said quietly, "because that night, after I went home, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about your face when you were walking out, and I realized something." He stopped gathering words. "Following orders doesn't mean you're innocent," he continued. "It just means you chose not to ask questions. And I'd been choosing not to ask questions for 20 years. So I leaked those emails." My coffee cup stopped halfway to my mouth. I leaked those emails." His voice cracked on the word leaked, like admitting to breaking something sacred. "Victor's memo, the ROI analysis, the whole strategy. I sent it all to Ashley Kern because I couldn't sleep, because I needed to do something that wasn't just following orders. Martin Cole, the man who'd executed Claire's plan, the man who'd stood beside Evan and taken instructions about removing me. He'd become the whistleblower who'd exposed everything. "The catering company fired me," he said. "This morning, said I violated client confidentiality. They're probably right. I probably destroyed my career. But I can sleep now." I reached for my wallet, pulled out enough cash for both our coffees, and set it on the table. "Thank you," I said. "For what?" "For choosing to ask questions." We sat there for a moment, in the kind of silence that feels comfortable rather than awkward. "What will you do now?" Martin asked. "Press conference lawsuit. The internet wants you to demand something." I thought about Nora's kitchen, about the way soup tastes better the second day when flavors have time to settle, about the small apartment I'd lived in for 42 years, and the glass cabinet with her ring and her letter, about the fact that I'd spent a week being someone the world was watching, and all I wanted was to go back to being someone the world forgot. "I'm going to cook," I said. "That's what I do." For the first time in a week, that felt like enough. 10 days after the wedding, I walked into a lawyer's office to make sure my son would never inherit a single dollar from me. Rebecca Moss's office was in a converted house near downtown Nashville. She was in her 50s, with reading glasses on a chain and the calm demeanor of someone who'd helped 1,000 people navigate difficult family decisions. "Mr. Bennett," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk, "you wanted to update your will." "I want to remove my son as my heir," I said. She pulled out a legal pad. "Completely?" "Yes." "May I ask why it helps me structure the document properly?" I thought about the wedding, the cornbread box, the phrase, "this staff member." About 27 years of sacrifices Evan had built an empire on, while claiming he'd built it from nothing. "He doesn't need my money," I said, "and I don't want him to have it." Rebecca wrote a note. "Is there anyone else you'd like to designate as beneficiary?" I hesitated. Then I thought about cycles and choices and the children we raise versus the adults they become. "Leave him nothing," I said, "but add a clause. If he ever has children, if I ever have grandchildren, and those children need help, there's a fund available for them. College, medical expenses, housing. But not for him, never for him, only for them." Rebecca looked up from her notepad. "So you're protecting grandchildren who don't exist yet from a father who—" "I understand. That's wise, Mr. Bennett. Not vindictive. Wise." When I signed the documents, I thought about Nora's letter, her warning that I loved Evan, in a way that made me forget I needed to be loved back. Maybe this was me learning the lesson she'd tried to teach. 2 weeks after the wedding, Evan appeared at my door. It was a Tuesday evening. I'd just finished dinner when I heard the knock. I opened the door, and there he was. No Claire, no suit. Just Evan in a regular shirt and jeans, looking more exhausted than I'd ever seen him. "Dad," he said, then stopped. Just stood there, mouth half open like he'd practiced what to say and forgotten all of it. I waited. I tried again, couldn't finish. I stepped back from the doorway. "Then don't say anything yet. Come in." He followed me inside. I made coffee and we sat at the kitchen table without speaking. Evan's coffee sat untouched on the table between us, steam rising and then fading and then gone like all the words neither of us could say. 20 minutes of silence, maybe longer. When does a man stop being your son and start being a stranger who shares your face? I looked at Evan sitting in my kitchen, and I couldn't tell any more where one ended and the other began. Finally I spoke. "You have a lot to figure out, son. Not with me. With yourself. I can't do that work for you." Evan looked up. His eyes were wet, but he wasn't crying. He just nodded. He stood, walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the knob. "I'm sorry," he said without turning around. Then he left. The coffee sat on the table cold until I poured it down the sink an hour later. 3 weeks after the wedding, I went to see Pastor James Holloway at the community church. I'd known James for 15 years since Nora's funeral. He was the kind of pastor who remembered names and asked genuine questions and didn't push faith on people who were figuring things out. I found him in his office, surrounded by books and papers. "Harold," he said, standing to shake my hand, "I've been following your story. I'm so sorry for what you've been through." "I'm all right," I said, which was mostly true. We talked for a while. About the wedding, about Evan, about what happens when the people you love become people you can't recognize. James listened the way good pastors do, without judgment, without advice, just presence. Then he asked, "Harold, what do you do best in this world?" I thought about 69 years of work of service, of standing in kitchens, feeding people who usually forgot me by the time they finished their meals. "I cook," I said. "That's all I've ever really known how to do." James smiled. "Then cook. Our community kitchen hasn't had a real head chef in 2 years. 40 children eat there every Tuesday and Thursday. We need someone who knows what they're doing, someone who cares." "I'm not a professional chef," I said. "You fed children for 31 years. That's more professional than anyone I know." I sat with that for a moment. A community kitchen, feeding kids who needed feeding, work that mattered not because it was public or impressive, but because it kept people from being hungry. "What would I call it?" I asked. James looked confused. "Call what?" "The kitchen. If I'm running it, I want to call it something." "Call it whatever you want, Harold." I thought about Nora, about her wedding ring in the glass cabinet, about the letter that told me not to disappear into waiting, about the way she'd always known that feeding people was my way of saying I love you. "Nora's kitchen," I said. James smiled. "Perfect." I drove home thinking of Nora. What would she say about all this? The will protecting grandchildren who didn't exist. The silence with Evan sitting in my kitchen, unable to speak. The decision to name a church kitchen after her so her memory could feed kids we'd never met. She'd probably just laugh that sound like light breaking through clouds. "Took you long enough, Harold." And she'd be right. 6 weeks after my son's wedding, I stood behind a community kitchen counter wearing an apron my wife embroidered 47 years ago, and for the first time in my life, I was cooking because I wanted to, not because I had to. Nora had stitched my name across the chest in 1976, the year we got married, back when her hands were steady, and we thought we'd have forever. The thread had faded from deep blue to soft gray, but every stitch still held. I'd found it in a box in the back of my closet 3 days before the opening, wrapped in tissue paper, like she'd known someday I'd need it again. Opening day at Nora's kitchen. Mid-November, 6 weeks after everything had fallen apart and somehow started coming back together. The community church had a commercial kitchen in the basement, not fancy, but functional. 6 burners, 2 ovens, industrial refrigerator. Enough counter space to serve 40 kids twice a week. Denise Walker stood beside me, prepping vegetables. Her catering company had refused to fire her after the public defended her for filming that video. But she'd quit anyway, said she wanted to work somewhere that mattered. She was here Tuesday and Thursday evenings helping me feed children. Pastor James Holloway stood at the entrance with a ribbon and scissors, waiting for the families who'd started lining up 20 minutes ago. "Nora's kitchen is open," he announced, cutting the ribbon, "because one man decided that dignity matters more than comfort. Harold, it's yours." The families came through, parents with tired faces and children with bright eyes. I served mac and cheese and baked chicken and green beans and cornbread, always cornbread, and watched plates fill and hands reach and mouths smile. A boy maybe 8 years old looked up at me while I was scooping mac and cheese onto his tray. "Are you the grandpa from the video?" he asked. His mother touched his shoulder, embarrassed. "Denny, that's rude." "I'm just the cook," I said, meeting the boy's eyes. "You want mac and cheese or chicken?" "Both," he said. I gave him both. That's what Nora would have wanted. Not the attention, not the recognition, not the vindication, or the viral videos, or the national news coverage that had turned my private humiliation into public discourse. Just this feeding people. Not for a paycheck, not because someone hired me, because it mattered. The apron's embroidered thread had faded from deep blue to soft gray, but Nora's stitches everyone still held. 8 weeks after the opening on a Thursday evening in late December, Denise and I were cleaning up after service. The families had gone home. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of running water and dishes clinking. "Mr. Bennett," Denise said, drying a pot, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you always save me a tray on Fridays back at Jefferson High?" I stopped washing the dish in my hand. Looked at her. She was 23 now, college student working part-time to pay tuition, same as she'd been doing since she was 12 years old. "Because you came in last," I said. "Kids who come last are usually the ones who need it most." She was quiet for a moment, set the pot down carefully. "I was always last because I had to stay after for makeup tests," she said. "My mom worked 2 jobs. Nobody was home to help me with homework, so I'd fail tests and have to retake them during lunch. By the time I got to the cafeteria, everything was gone." "I know," I said. "That's why I saved you a tray." "I never thanked you." I smiled. "You already did. You just did it 20 years later." She looked confused. "At the wedding," I said. "You tried to warn me, but you filmed what happened. You stood up for me when it cost you your job. That was you saying thank you. I just didn't know it at the time." Denise's eyes got wet. She didn't cry, just stood there holding a dish towel, understanding something she hadn't understood before. "Kindness is bread dough," I said, turning back to the sink. "You never see it rise until you stop watching, and then suddenly it's doubled." We finished cleaning in comfortable silence. That night I drove home through Nashville's streets that felt familiar again. Not the same as they'd been 6 weeks ago. Nothing would ever be exactly the same, but familiar, in the way old clothes are familiar, even after you've worn them through something hard. I thought about circles, about how you feed a hungry teenager, and 20 years later, she tries to save you from public humiliation, about how you carry a 7-year-old out of a fire, and 34 years later, he orders you removed from his wedding, about how some kindnesses compound, and some sacrifices corrode, and you never know which is which until time tells you. I thought about Evan. He hadn't called since that Tuesday when he'd shown up at my door, unable to speak. Hadn't written. Hadn't reached out. I'd seen in the news that Claire had gone back to her family's estate, that Bennett Capital was struggling, that investors were asking questions about founder integrity and company culture. But I didn't know what Evan was thinking. Didn't know if he was figuring out what he needed to figure out. Didn't know if he even could. I pulled into my apartment parking lot and sat in the car for a moment before going inside. I thought about Denise asking why I'd saved her trays, about her not knowing for 20 years that someone had seen her, had cared, had made sure she didn't go hungry. And I wondered, will Evan remember? Will he remember 20 years from now? Will there be a moment some random Tuesday when he's 54 and I'm gone, when he'll suddenly understand what it cost me to give him everything? Will there be some meal, some sacrifice he's forgotten, that will suddenly matter? Or will he just keep moving forward, building his next company, telling his next origin story, convinced that he really did do it all alone? I didn't know, but I knew this. I'd done what I could do. I'd protected future grandchildren who might never exist. I'd set a boundary with compassion. I'd created something with Nora's name on it that would feed children long after I was gone. I'd stopped waiting, and maybe that was enough. 2 months after the wedding, I found a handwritten envelope in my mailbox with no return address, just my name in handwriting I'd know anywhere because I taught Evan to write cursive when he was 7. I stood there on my front porch holding it for a full minute before I went inside. The paper was expensive, thick cream stock, the kind Evan always preferred for important correspondence. My hands shook as I opened it. Dad began. Not Harold, not Father, just Dad. "I need to tell you something I should have said at the reception, but I was too much of a coward." When Rebecca showed me that photo, you in your server's vest, standing next to the champagne table, I told her I had no idea you were working there. I acted shocked. I let everyone believe I'd been blindsided. I sat down at my kitchen table. The morning light came through the window at the same angle it had for 27 years. That was a lie, the letter continued. I knew you were on the serving staff 2 weeks before the wedding. Melanie's event coordinator sent me the vendor list, and your name was right there under additional evening service personnel. I saw it. I read it 3 times. And then I deleted the email and decided to pretend I never had. My coffee had gone cold. I couldn't remember making it. I told myself you'd cancel, that you'd realize how awkward it would be and back out on your own. I told myself it was your choice to take the job, so whatever happened was on you. I built this whole narrative where I was the victim, where your presence at my wedding as hired help was something you were doing to me, not something you were doing for yourself, because I'd made it impossible for you to attend any other way. The handwriting got messier toward the middle of the second page, like he'd been writing faster. The truth is, I didn't want to face what it meant. If I acknowledged that you were working my wedding because you couldn't afford to attend as a guest, then I'd have to acknowledge every other thing I'd spent 34 years not looking at. The apartment you lived in, the car you drove, the fact that you bought my textbooks but wore the same 3 shirts in rotation for a decade. I got up and opened the cabinet above my refrigerator, the one I never use for anything practical. Inside were 3 things, Nora's apron folded carefully: the program from Evan's college graduation, and a photo of the 2 of us from his 8th birthday. Both of us covered in flour because we'd tried to bake his cake ourselves and failed spectacularly. 3 artifacts, 3 decades, 1 truth I'd been carrying alone. I chose willful blindness, Evan wrote, because seeing clearly would have required me to change, to call more often, to visit, to ask if you needed anything instead of assuming you were fine because you never complained. It was easier to believe you were just simple and content, that you didn't want more, didn't need more than to admit I'd become the kind of son who'd let his father work as a caterer at his own child's wedding. The letter went on for another page. He talked about the fire, about how he'd spent 27 years believing I blamed him for Nora's death, because I'd never explicitly said I didn't. He talked about Stanford, about how he'd felt both proud and guilty, how that guilt had curdled into resentment, because resentment was easier to carry than gratitude. I don't expect forgiveness, he finished. I'm not even sure I'm asking for it. I just needed you to know that I saw you. I've always seen you. I just didn't have the courage to look. There was no signature, just a phone number at the bottom, not his cell, something else. Maybe a new number, maybe a line I could reach him on if I decided to call. I folded the letter and put it in the cabinet with the other 3 things. Then I drove to Nashville. Nora's grave is in a small cemetery off Dickerson Pike, under a maple tree we picked together during one of our better years. I hadn't been there since I opened the kitchen, hadn't needed to somehow. But I needed to now. The grass was cold and damp under my knees as I knelt down. Someone had left flowers recently, though I didn't know who. Maybe Denise. Maybe someone else Nora had fed before the fire. I got a letter from Evan, I said out loud. He knew I was working his wedding. He knew the whole time. A breeze moved through the maple branches. I don't know if that makes it better or worse, I continued. Better because he wasn't as blind as I thought. Worse because he saw and did nothing. I stayed there for an hour just talking. I told Nora about the kitchen, about Denise, about the way I'd finally stopped waiting for Evan to understand, and started building something that didn't require his understanding to matter. You asked me to stay present, I said finally. Not to chase him, not to fix him, just to stay present for whatever he needed if he ever needed it. I think I did that. I think I'm still doing it. The sun was setting when I drove home. I thought about calling the number at the bottom of Evan's letter. I thought about writing back. I thought about driving to California and showing up at whatever address matched that phone number and demanding what? An apology? A relationship? Some retroactive rewriting of 34 years? But when I got home, I just made dinner. Cornbread and beans, same as always. I ate at my table. I washed my dishes. I set my alarm for 5 a.m. Because here's what I've learned after 69 years. Healing isn't about reconciliation. It's not about getting the ending you wanted or the apology you deserved. It's about building a life that doesn't require those things to be whole. Evan's letter sits in my cabinet now, next to Nora's apron and our flower-covered photo. Maybe someday I'll call that number, maybe I won't. Either way, I'll still get up tomorrow. I'll still bake cornbread. I'll still open the kitchen door on time. That routine, that simple, honest rhythm is enough. Tomorrow I get up at 5 a.m. I bake cornbread. I open the kitchen door on time. That routine, that simple, honest rhythm is enough. 6 months after my son's wedding, nobody recognized me anymore. I was just Mr. Harold, the cook who always put extra cornbread on the trays of kids who came in last. The viral moment lasted exactly 3 weeks. Then the algorithm moved on, and so did everyone else. By December, I was back to being invisible, which was exactly what I'd wanted all along. Tuesday morning, 5 a.m. The kitchen smelled like yeast and coffee and the particular sweetness of cornbread baking in commercial ovens. I pulled 6 trays from the top rack, set them on the cooling counter, and started the porridge. Same routine I'd followed for 6 months. Same rhythm Nora had followed for 14 years before the fire. Denise arrived at 5:30, tied her apron without a word, and began slicing fruit. We'd developed a system. She handled prep, I handled cooking, and neither of us wasted energy on unnecessary conversation. It worked. By 7 a.m., the line was forming outside. 30 people, maybe 40, families with young kids, a few elderly folks who came for the company as much as the food. 2 teenagers I recognized from the high school down the street, probably skipping first period. I unlocked the door and stepped aside. They filed in quietly. No pushing, no rush. That was one thing I'd learned from Nora's old notebooks. If you treat people with dignity, they'll usually return it. We served cafeteria style. Porridge in the big steel tureen, bread and cornbread in baskets, fresh fruit in bowls, coffee and milk at the end. "Morning, Mr. Harold," a woman said as I ladled porridge into her bowl. "Morning, Rita," I said. "How's your daughter?" "Better. The fever broke." "Good. Extra cornbread today. Take 2 pieces." She nodded grateful and moved down the line. That was the whole conversation. No speeches. No explanations. Just food and the quiet acknowledgement that sometimes people need a little extra, and that's nobody's business but theirs. By 8:15 the rush had slowed. Denise was refilling the coffee urn. I was wiping down the serving counter when I noticed the light. The morning light through the kitchen windows falls the same way every Tuesday, steady, predictable, asking nothing, which is exactly what I need. It doesn't care about viral moments or estranged sons or letters folded in cabinets. It just comes through the glass at the same angle, touches the same steel surfaces, and moves on. There's a peace in that kind of constancy, a promise that some things will keep showing up whether you deserve them or not. I turned back to the counter and saw a man I'd served twice before Derek. I think his name was carrying his tray to a corner table. He sat alone, ate slowly, and left his dishes in the collection bin without being asked. Small dignities, small courtesies. The kind of thing you only notice when you've spent 69 years learning what actually matters. "Need more bread out front?" Denise said, appearing at my elbow with an empty basket. I grabbed a fresh tray from the warmer and refilled it. She took it without comment and headed back to the serving line. Denise refills the bread basket without me asking, and I realize this quiet coordination, this unspoken rhythm is what partnership looks like when you're not performing it. No grand declarations, no promises about forever, just 2 people showing up at 5:30 a.m. because the work matters and someone needs to do it. By 8:45 we were almost done. The line had dwindled to 3 people. An elderly man I recognized from the Baptist church, a young mother with a toddler on her hip, and a girl maybe 8 years old standing at the back in a jacket, 2 sizes too big with a tear in the left sleeve. The girl waited her turn. When she reached the counter, I ladled porridge into her bowl and added a piece of cornbread. Then I added a second piece, the end piece, with the crispy edge, the kind kids usually fought over. She looked up at me, brown eyes, serious face, the kind of careful expression kids wear when they're used to things being taken away. "Thank you, sir," she said quietly. "You're welcome, sweetheart," I said. "Same time Thursday." She nodded and carried her tray toward the tables. She held it with both hands, careful and deliberate, like it was something precious. Like if she wasn't gentle, it might disappear. And I remembered Evan at 7. Same careful grip, same quiet gratitude, same worn jacket his had been. Blue hers was gray, but the size was wrong, the same way. That year after the fire, when I was working 3 jobs and still couldn't afford new clothes, Evan had carried his school lunch tray exactly like that, gentle, afraid to take up too much space. I used to wonder if he remembered those years, if he remembered being the kid who came in last, who needed extra, who said thank you in a voice barely above a whisper. Now I know he remembered. He just spent 30 years trying to forget. I watched the girl, Emma someone had called her earlier, sit at a corner table. She ate slowly, making the food last. When she finished, she brought her tray to the collection bin, said thank you again, and left through the side door. The memory of Evan at 7 didn't hurt anymore. It just was. A fact. A moment in time that had shaped both of us in different ways. I'd learned to keep showing up. He'd learned to pretend he never needed anyone to. Maybe someday he'd learn something different. Maybe he wouldn't. Either way, I'd still be here Thursday morning at 5 a.m. pulling cornbread from the oven and putting extra pieces on the trays of kids who came in last. Because that's what you do. You show up, you serve, you give what you can to people who need it, and you don't keep score. I turned back to start the cleanup. That's when the kitchen door opened, and someone I didn't expect walked in. It was Denise's daughter dropping off her mother's phone. Simple as that. She handed it to me, said thank you, and left. The door closed. The kitchen settled back into its familiar quiet. That afternoon, while wiping down the counter, I looked up and saw a boy's face pressed against the kitchen window. 9 years old, maybe 10 eyes fixed on the last box of cornbread, like it was the only thing in the world that mattered. He didn't knock, didn't wave, just stood there with his hands cupped around his face to block the glare staring through the glass, like he was memorizing something he knew he couldn't have. I recognized that look. I'd seen it in the mirror 40 years ago. I set down my towel and walked to the window. When our eyes met, he flinched, ready to run. I held up one hand, wait, and pointed toward the side door. Come in, I called through the glass. It's okay. He hesitated, looked left then right, checking if anyone was watching. Then he moved slowly toward the door. When he stepped inside, I could see he was smaller than I'd thought. Thin wrists, jacket that didn't quite zip all the way, shoes with soles coming loose at the toes. You hungry? I asked. He nodded once, sharp and quick, like admitting it out loud might make it disappear. I picked up the box of cornbread, 6 pieces left still warm from the late batch I'd made to use up the last of the batter, and walked over to him. It's yours, I said, placing it in his hands. He looked down at the box, then up at me, then back at the box. All of it, he whispered. All of it. I expected him to open it right there. To eat 1 piece, maybe 2, the way most kids did. But he didn't. He tucked the box inside his jacket, pressed it against his ribs, and zipped the jacket as far as it would go, hiding it, protecting it, taking it somewhere else to someone else. And I knew. He wasn't hungry for himself, or maybe he was, but someone else was hungrier. Someone waiting at home, a younger sibling, a parent who'd skip meals so he could eat, someone who needed this more than he did. That's what Evan used to do. Age 7, 8, 9. He'd take the extra food I'd pack in his lunch, granola bars, crackers, whatever I could afford, and bring it home unopened. I never asked who it was for. He never told me. But every Thursday, the school counselor would quietly slip an extra milk carton into his backpack, and every Thursday it would come home empty. Some things don't change. Some things shouldn't. Thank you, sir, the boy said. What's your name? I asked. Tommy. I'm Mr. Harold. We're open Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday mornings. 7 a.m. You come by whenever you need to, okay? He nodded again, still clutching the box through his jacket. Okay, he said, and then he ran. The boy ran off with cornbread hidden against his ribs, carrying it like a secret, which is what all love is when you're young and the world hasn't taught you. It's allowed to be visible. You hide it in pockets and jackets and folded up notes you don't dare read out loud, because if people see it, they might take it away. That's what poverty teaches you first, to make yourself small. Your needs smaller, your love smallest of all. So there's less to lose when the world decides you've had enough. I finished cleaning, locked the kitchen, drove home as the winter sun dropped below the Philadelphia skyline. By the time I reached my apartment, it was dark. I made coffee the same cheap brand I'd been drinking for 27 years and sat at my kitchen table. Not to read, not to watch television, just to sit. In front of me on the small shelf against the wall was a glass cabinet I'd bought at a second-hand store 6 months ago. Inside were 3 things I'd decided mattered enough to keep visible. Nora's wedding ring, white gold single small diamond purchased in 1980, with money I'd saved from a summer construction job. I'd sold it in 1999 for $2,800 to pay for Evan's textbooks. I'd bought it back 3 years ago from the same pawn shop on Market Street for $3,200. The owner remembered me, said he'd been holding it just in case. Nora's letter, written 8 months before the fire during one of our last good weeks. 3 pages in her careful handwriting, talking about the kitchen she wanted to open someday, about the people she wanted to feed, about staying present even when life asked you to run. The last line, promise me you'll still be here, not for him, for yourself. Evan's letter, the one that arrived 2 months after his wedding, admitting he'd known I was working his reception, admitting he'd chosen blindness over confrontation, admitting all the things I'd stopped needing him to admit by the time he finally said them. 3 letters, 3 artifacts, 3 different versions of love, the one I married, the one I lost, the one I'm still learning to accept. I don't open Nora's letter tonight, or Evan's, because some nights you don't need to read the words. You just need to know they exist, that they were written, that someone tried. That's enough. That has to be enough. I sip my coffee. It's bitter and lukewarm, same as always. Outside my window, Nashville lights flicker in the distance. No Philadelphia lights. I've been here 27 years, and sometimes I still forget which city holds me. The lights scatter across the skyline like stars that forgot their constellations. Each one, somebody's kitchen, somebody's table, somebody's quiet evening after a long day. I think about Tommy with cornbread pressed against his ribs, about Emma with her careful grip, about Evan at 7 before the world asked him to be someone else, about Denise showing up at 5:30 a.m. without being asked, about the morning light that comes through the same windows every Tuesday, steady and predictable and asking nothing. I think about Nora and promises and what it means to stay, not to fix, not to chase, not to wait for some future moment when everything finally makes sense, just to stay, to show up, to bake cornbread at 5 a.m. and put extra pieces on the trays of kids who come in last. The coffee grows cold in my hands. I set it down, look at the 3 things in the glass cabinet one more time, and smile. I kept my promise, Nora. I'm still here. And to you listening to my story, remember this. What looks like Dad, revenge against family, is sometimes just a father refusing to disappear. For years I thought making sacrifices meant erasing myself. I believed that being a good dad meant staying quiet when my son pulled away, accepting that his success required my invisibility. Don't make my mistake. Don't confuse love with silence. Don't let family betrayal convince you that your presence doesn't matter. When family betrayal happens, you have a choice, and revenge doesn't have to mean destruction. I should have spoken up sooner, not with anger, but with truth. Here's what I learned. True dad, revenge for family wounds, isn't about punishment, it's about showing up anyway. It's about opening the kitchen when your family forgets your name. It's about giving extra cornbread to kids who come last because you remember being invisible. Family betrayal will test you, but it doesn't define you. I believe God put me through this to teach me that staying present, not for my son, but for myself, is the only dad revenge my family needed to see. The kind of family betrayal revenge that actually heals is choosing presence over bitterness. Healing doesn't require reconciliation, it just requires truth. Now I want to hear from you. Have you faced family betrayal, where revenge seemed like the only option? Did you choose, Dad, revenge against family members, or did you find another path? Leave a comment below and share your perspective. Your story might help someone else who's struggling with their own family betrayal revenge journey. If this resonated with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Dad's Sweet Revenge for more stories about finding strength after betrayal. Thank you for staying until the very end. Your time means more than you know. A final reminder, this story contains fictionalized elements for storytelling purposes, but the message about present sacrifice and what it means to keep showing up, that's the truth that matters.